why the US-Canada border is the longest peaceful one. The border between the United States and Canada stretches for more than 8,800 kilometers, the longest international boundary in the world, and yet for more than 2 centuries it has remained almost entirely peaceful. No walls, no armies, no fortresses bristling with weapons, just forests, lakes, and small signs marking the line where two nations meet. But this calm frontier wasn't born from luck or geography. It was built through hard lessons, close calls, and unlikely cooperation. To understand how the world's most peaceful border came to be, we have to go back to when it was anything but peaceful. In the 1700s, Britain and France fought bitterly for control of North America. The wars that followed, from the 7 Years' War to the American Revolution, carved the continent into rival colonies. When the United States declared independence in 1776, the boundary between British Canada and the new American Republic became a dividing line not of friendship but of fear. The first decades after independence were tense. Britain still controlled Canada, and many Americans believed it was only a matter of time before the new republic expanded northward. Some saw Canada as unfinished business, a piece of the continent that had slipped away. This ambition boiled over in 1812, when the United States launched an invasion to liberate Canada from British rule. That war, however, did not go as planned. American troops crossed the border 3 separate times, expecting the local population to welcome them. Instead, they met fierce resistance from British soldiers, indigenous warriors, and Canadian militias defending their homes. The result was a costly stalemate. When peace was signed in 1814, the border remained unchanged. But something else had changed. The idea that the two nations could never truly conquer each other. For the first time, both sides realized they had more to gain from peace than from war. The War of 1812 had shown that geography, weather, and willpower made the North American frontier a place where victories were temporary, but losses could last for generations. The forests and rivers between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean became natural barriers, but also natural bridges. Still, old habits die hard. The border remained disputed for decades. In the 1830s, a logging conflict in Maine nearly sparked another war between the US and Britain. It was known as the Aroostook War, even though no one was killed. Lumberjacks from both sides argued over trees, arrested each other, and threatened violence. The situation grew so tense that militias were called up, but instead of fighting, diplomats intervened. In 1842, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty settled the matter peacefully. It was one of the first times in modern history that two rival powers chose compromise over conflict. That treaty set a precedent, one that would define the relationship even for centuries. When the Oregon boundary dispute flared up in the 1840s, it could easily have led to war again. The rallying cry in the US was 54-40 or fight, a demand to claim all of modern-day Canada's Pacific coast. But instead of fighting, both nations negotiated. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 drew the border along the 49th parallel, a straight line stretching from Minnesota to the Pacific Ocean. It was a simple solution and a symbol of a growing desire for peace. By the mid-1800s, a new pattern had emerged. The United States looked south and west for expansion, while Canada, still under British influence, developed cautiously, preferring diplomacy to conflict. The two nations grew side by side, like siblings with very different personalities. And while other parts of the world fell into wars over territory, the US and Canada built a tradition of negotiation. That tradition was tested again after Canada became a self-governing dominion in 1867. Questions about fishing rights, navigation, and resources kept arising along the border, but instead of sending soldiers, both countries sent commissioners and surveyors. They drew precise maps, placed iron markers, and even held joint picnics to celebrate their progress. The two nations were literally drawing peace into the landscape. The turning point came in 1871 with the Treaty of Washington. It addressed nearly every remaining grievance, from fishing disputes to the destruction caused by British-built ships during the American Civil War. The agreement wasn't perfect, but it proved that diplomacy could solve even the thorniest issues. From that moment forward, the US and Canada stopped preparing for war with each other and started preparing to live as neighbors. By the early 20th century, the idea of a hostile border between the two countries had become almost unthinkable. During World War I, Canadian and American soldiers fought side by side in Europe. When the Great Depression hit, both nations faced hardship together, and their shared border became a symbol of resilience rather than rivalry. World War II only deepened that bond. In 1940, the two governments signed the Ogdensburg Agreement, establishing a permanent board for joint defense. It was a bold statement. Instead of guarding the border against each other, they would defend defend it together. Canadian and American troops coordinated coastal defenses, air patrols, and logistics. The longest border in the world had officially become the safest. After the war, the relationship evolved into something even more unique. Trade flourished. Highways and railways linked the two countries. Families crossed the border daily for work, education, and vacations. What had once been a symbol of separation became a bridge of opportunity. By the 1960s, the border wasn't a line of defense. It was a handshake, but that doesn't mean it's been without challenges. The Cold War brought new pressures as both nations watched the Arctic closely for potential threats. Yet even in the age of nuclear anxiety, the US and Canada managed their defense in partnership through organizations like NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. The same skies that once divided them were now jointly protected. The partnership deepened after 9/11 when both nations strengthened border security without tearing down the principle of openness. Today, millions of people and billions of dollars cross the border every day. It remains both one of the most active and one of the most peaceful boundaries on Earth, a rare combination that few countries have ever achieved. What makes this peace even more remarkable is how fragile it could have been. Geography alone didn't make the border calm. People did. Generations of diplomats, soldiers, settlers, and citizens chose cooperation over conflict. They built trust not through grand speeches, but through small acts, shared rivers, shared roads, and shared respect. The US and Canada also share something deeper, a mutual understanding of what the alternative looks like. Both nations were born out of war, but both learned that peace is harder and far more valuable to maintain. That understanding has guided everything from trade negotiations to environmental policy. Even when disagreements arise, both sides know where the line is drawn, and that crossing it solves nothing. Today, when travelers cross from one country to the other, they're passing through more than just a checkpoint. They're moving across centuries of diplomacy, compromise, and restraint. The quiet forests, frozen lakes, and prairies that mark the border are living monuments to that history. In a world where borders often divide and conflict defines relationships, the US-Canada boundary stands as proof that peace is possible, not by accident, but by choice. It's the result of generations who decided that friendship was a better investment than fear. And perhaps that's why this line, the longest border on Earth, doesn't need walls or weapons to protect it. Just trust, history, and two nations that learned how to live side by side without letting the past repeat itself.